Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, here today with SupChina columnist Mark Dreyer. Today we're going to be talking about the economics and government influence in Chinese sports culture. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
That's great to be here.
Fantastic. So, Mark, what has been your favorite few spectator sports experience since you moved to China pre-Olympics?
I mean, you mentioned the Olympics, and I have to start there. There were a few highlights, but definitely the number one was, there's a bit of a story. I guess we got some time. So, as a Brit who, I'm actually half Canadian, I was working as an accredited journalist for Canadian TV, CBC. Now, as a journalist at the Olympics, you get a media pass, so you can go to any events when you're not working, and you work typically very long hours. But the 100 meters men's final was something that I was off for. And I called a few friends and I was like, hey, where do you want to watch it? And I'd forgotten that my friend who had watched a lot of the stuff with, he actually had a ticket. So he was in the stadium. So, now I'm going to have to watch it by myself. And then he said, well, the media area looks kind of empty. Now, normally there's a lot of seats available for media, but for the big events of which the 100 meters final is one, you need a separate ticket. But there'd just been a big rainstorm, and I think the walk from the media broadcast center to the Bird's Nest Stadium, I think had put a lot of people off. And this was about half an hour beforehand. So I jumped in a taxi, got into the stadium 10 minutes before the race. I was off, so grabbed a beer on the way in. And just waltzed down to the front of the section. I was in the fourth row. I sat next to Steve Redgrave, who is a legend of Olympic and British rowing. Won 5 gold medals.
The renowned Steve Redgrave.
There you go, Sir Steve, as he's now known, and he was there as basically a color commentator for the BBC, but he was off as well. So there I was, drinking beer with Sir Steve. Fourth row, basically down the 80 meters down the 100 meter straight, right about the moment where Usain Bolt starts to celebrate early. And I always joke and say, well, he turned and looked to the crowd. He's basically looking right at me where I was, starts to celebrate early and still broke the world record. And that was a race that people still talk about, and I certainly remember it.
And how about this recent Mavericks game?
Yeah,
here in Shanghai?
So more recently, I mean, I've been to lots. I've probably seen a lot of sports over the years in China. But just last month, NBA preseason games. Every season, before the season kicks off back in the States, 2 of the teams come over to Greater China. This year it was Shanghai and Shenzhen, the 2 games. And it was basically a full-level NBA experience. Now, people in the States, if they're listening there, might be like, well, so what? We get that all the time. But honestly, putting on a production of that kind of quality is no mean feat in China.
Sure.
And if they've been to some of the other sporting events at the under end of the entertainment scale, should we say, they'll understand just how hard it is. But it was fantastic. It was everything that you'd expect from an NBA game. And the crowd, every seat was absolutely full until the very, very end for a preseason game.
Yeah.
The experience was great, but that shows you basketball is a big, big thing here.
Sure. So maybe let's start and talk about the evolution of basketball as well as the CBA in China. So can we talk about the evolution of the players and Yao Ming's role?
Sure. Well, Yao Ming was not the first Chinese player to play in the NBA. That was Wang Zhezhe, who played for the Dallas Mavericks a few years before him. And the Mavericks kind of actually, it was interesting that they were here again this summer. They've sort of kept a bit of a China connection through that. There have now been 6 Chinese players, I believe, to have played in the NBA. But Yao Ming, by far the most famous, had by far the longest career and most impressive career as NBA All-Star as well. And of course, everyone, if you have to name a Chinese person,
Period.
Yeah. People are not going for the politicians. They're not plucking Xi Jinping unless they're into global politics. Yao Ming is probably at the top of that list alongside Jackie Chan, isn't he? So he hasn't played for a long time, but basketball was popular before he played for the Rockets, but he really kind of took the sport into the stratosphere.
Sure.
And that cemented the NBA as the absolute top league here. Soccer is probably equally popular, but there's lots of different leagues. There's the German league, the Italian league, the British league, the Spanish league, and so on. So, and of course the Chinese league, as there is in basketball. But yes, he has really changed a lot, both with his time on court for the Rockets, and the Rockets now widely known as China's team because of Yao. But now in his new role as the head of the CBA, he has been trying to push through. Effectively, he's trying to modernize the sport.
Sure. So it's been an interesting experience for me, just kind of playing pickup basketball, seeing what jerseys people are wearing, chatting with people about the NBA. The knowledge level here is unbelievable. And, in classes, people are streaming the games in the mornings because, 9 a.m. here is 9 p.m. on the East Coast, right? But when I ask folks if they go to CBA games, if they follow the Beijing team, I get laughs, basically. Why would we watch this inferior product? The NBA is so great. There's no Steph Curry running around with the Beijing Ducks, right? But this is something that Yao Ming, over the past 2 years, I guess now, he's been put in charge of the Chinese Basketball Association and has really been tasked with bringing it up to a standard closer to the NBA. But it seems like he's encountered a lot of resistance on that path. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's a very well-respected figure, both on and off the court. It obviously helps that he's 7'6".
Sure.
But he went back to school. He got I think a master's. He's part of one of the larger political bodies here, so he sort of attended important meetings. All the officials, of course, know who he is, but they've met him as well. And so, but he has that presence just because he played for close to a decade in the NBA, so he knows how the best league in the world, in terms of certainly in that sport, should be run and how it's run. And so everyone kind of trusts him that what he's trying to do is for the benefit of China. He's seen it, he's a loyal Chinese guy, but also, he has that Western experience.
Sure. No, it's interesting. You wrote that, to quote Yao, Chinese basketball has no so-called biggest problem, but problems everywhere. And a lot of the reforms that when he initially came in, there was a lot of pushback within the association. You wrote that he had 3 major suggestions when he first came in. Divide the league into 2 conferences, increase the number of games for each team. Right now it's 38, which is pretty low compared to the NBA's 82, right? And shorten the training period for the national team and adopt a system used by the NBA where, the best players only play for a few weeks as opposed to being plucked out of their team for months and months on end, as well as shorten the court time of non-Chinese Asian players. So the sort of tier 2, not ex-NBA guys, but, these other folks running around. But the response was CBA officials saying that Yao's reforms are, quote, not suited to China's national circumstances. So there is definitely a deep state in the Chinese basketball universe, it seems, that Yao's had to fight off to increase the standard of the CBA.
Yeah, and it's certainly not as simple in China as just saying, well, okay, everyone kind of agrees we need to reform it. Who's the guy to do it? We all agree it's Yao.
Sure.
It's certainly not a given that he's going to be able to do this. I think there were 19 vice presidents who were still there when he was brought in. None of them were basketball people, and they all have their own entrenched interests, not necessarily fighting against everything he's trying to do. But I mean, that gives you an idea. Like, he's not bringing in his own cleaning house. Like, he's trying to go around and above these people, and it's just not that easy. He has had some successes, and certainly in terms of commercializing the league, but bringing in some new deals, and that all helps. But
there's a draft now.
Yes,
that's exciting.
No, it's good. But I think with a lot of sports, the problem is China has had a certain amount of success in sports, largely in the Olympics, and this has been a problem because the places where China has had success is typically in the individual sports where you can just drill people again and again and again. Diving is the perfect example.
Sure.
Diving, you're supposed to do the same thing repeatedly 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, and at the end of it, if you have enough people doing this, you pick the best and they'll win Olympic gold.
Yeah.
Now that is a system, a tried and tested system for China that has produced gold after gold at the Olympics. But that mentality does not work at all when it comes to the team sports. So, the overtraining of players, like, ruins players. Like, so young basketball prospects, the last thing they should be doing is, training 3 times a day, but that's sometimes what they're up against in the Chinese youth systems here.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, though, because people always use this example, oh, these Chinese gymnasts, oh, these Chinese divers, these Chinese swimmers, where they get drilled, the life gets drilled out of them, but, and they're secluded and their parents die, but no one tells them until after the big tournament or whatever. But at the same time, I mean, racket sports is while not a team sport, something that definitely needs more sort of creative flair and style, and the success that China's been able to pump out in terms of badminton players and table tennis players is something I think worth noting. Is there anything different in those systems that maybe can account for the success in those areas?
Well, I'll just go back to one of the things you mentioned in terms of having the life drilled out of them, and I think there has been a change amongst the public that says, this win at all costs, this gold at all cost mentality, it isn't necessarily great for the country moving forward because they've reached a later stage. And so actually the state, training schools for all these sports have actually found some problems recruiting. They used to go to all the villages in the rural areas.
So interesting.
Well, and it was a big honor. But now parents are thinking like, well, to be honest, the chance of my kid becoming Olympic champion are pretty small. And I'll just tell you one story. I remember I covered the London Olympics as well in 2012. And I'm blanking on the name of the person, but it was a young Chinese girl who I think got a bronze medal. Could have the details wrong, but the main part of the story was, she was asked by a Western journalist, just usual press conference questions. Oh, what's your background, blah, 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 were your parents happy? She goes, I don't know. I haven't spoken to them yet. And they go, were they watching? And she goes, I don't know.
Yeah.
She actually said, I don't know. She was taken away. And she was 15 or 16. She, secluded in training camp for such a long time. I didn't even know if her parents were watching her win an Olympic medal.
Yeah.
It was just astounding. It was such a sad moment because the journalist wasn't trying to trip her up. It was just sort of making... you're not
throwing hardball questions at a 15-year-old, right?
Wow, that was a sucker punch.
Sure. So let's now turn to policy number 46, released in October 2014, which seems to have been a seminal moment in the evolution of sports as an industry in China. So what was this document and what was the impact it had?
Well, this was effectively the moment in China where sports became part of the wider economy. It was coming off a stage where the economy was slowing down after years and years of double-digit growth, and China was looking for new economic drivers for growth. Now, they looked at the States and saw all these big TV deals with the NFL and the NBA and saw that the wider sports industry with Nike and all these other big firms are roughly accounting for 3% of US GDP. Now, in China, it was a fraction of 1%. So they thought, well, here's an area where we can develop from scratch and it can be a legitimate new driver for growth.
Sure.
And it ticks all the boxes that the government wanted at the time and still today wants. It helps them rebalance the economy towards domestic consumption. If you have people playing sports, they're buying tickets to events, they're buying gear, they're playing sports, coaching and all this sort of stuff. It's a healthier population, a happier population, and a more successful population on the sports field. So there's nothing... it's a win-win. China loves a win-win, but this really is a win-win, of course, if they can get it to work. So
Sure.
This was the moment where they effectively kind of declared in writing that they wanted to develop the sports industry, and they targeted creating the biggest sports industry in the world by 2025, worth 5 trillion renminbi, about 800 billion US dollars. And
sure, why not?
Yeah, why not? And so... As a result, a lot of people started to think about sports and investing in sports because it was both seen as politically smart, but also financially smart if this was going to be the next big boom area. And so what we saw is probably 3 main areas of growth in sort of 3 waves, I should say. The first one is in March 2015. There was a 50-point plan to reform Chinese soccer, and that helped. We've seen some significant changes particularly at the top end of the professional game since then. Then, shortly afterwards, China won the rights to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. And so winter sports has seen a big growth stage since then, and that's continuing. And then we've also seen a sort of just a wider thing, partly driven by government policy, but also I think just driven by social changes as people have tried to embrace becoming healthier, realizing that study is not the be-all and end-all of human existence for themselves and for their children. So we've seen social trend of people getting into sports. So more people running, more people doing marathons and triathlons and swimming and so on.
So let's now turn to some of the recent developments in the Chinese Super League. So one of the big standout things that have probably caught the most headlines in the West has been these enormous contracts of kind of aging but still pretty enormous stars who've made it big in top European leagues coming here making 20, 30, 40 million dollars for a year or two. So what were the drivers of these enormous contracts, and how has the league tried to pull back on this, what they see as rampant spending?
There have been some older stars here, but China has generally tried to recruit players still in their 20s, still in their prime.
Sure.
I think the league, as much as it is due criticism in many areas, I think it does get a bit of a harsh rap when it comes to this, because the MLS in the States, for example, was kind of seen as this graveyard for players. So Wayne Rooney is the latest. He basically was sort of
retirement home. Come
retirement
on,
home.
Yeah. Graveyard's a little harsh.
Sure. Well, okay, retirement home for the 35s and above.
Yeah.
Whereas again, Oscar came from Chelsea, and he was still a very, very good player. He was 26, I think, when he came, and a few others have also fit that bill. But it comes from this going back to the policy document that sparked a big wave. In fact, we won't go into the details, but basically when the CSL TV rights were renegotiated shortly afterwards, the new deal was worth 20 times what the previous deal had been worth. And so clubs are suddenly that much richer, and they're thinking, well, the only way is up. We're just at the beginning of this boom cycle. And so suddenly they're feeling a lot more flush, and the government has said, hey, go buy some players. Effectively, that's what they're hearing with this green light for sports.
Sure. And
Xi Jinping known to be a soccer guy, and so suddenly they're trying to outspend each other. There's definitely a little bit of the bosses of the companies, and it's large real estate companies often involved, and trying to outspend each other with the biggest wage packet and the biggest transfer signing. So that was getting attention. We also saw some outbound investment with Chinese groups buying clubs overseas. Now, quite rightly, I think you have to say, the government realized that neither of these two things particularly benefited Chinese football. If you judge, and there's many ways to judge Chinese football, but if you have a system that is working, you should have a national team that is improving and playing well and doing well on a global level. China is one of the world leaders in many different areas. In soccer, it most certainly is not.
Sure.
And so it looked at this, well, how does buying a club in Europe help Chinese soccer? There's incremental, there's small amounts of synergies perhaps if you're involved also in soccer back here, but basically it doesn't. Also, getting the big stars, well, it helps attract some attention to the game, but unless maybe there's a little bit of skill that the
rubs
teammates
off.
Rubs off. The teammates are picking up something in training, but they can learn from coaches as well. So it's just huge amounts of money that would be far better spent on youth academies or better pitches, better stadiums, better everything. And so quite rightly, it moved to stop all these things. I've compared in the past Chinese soccer to a super tanker, like an oil tanker.
Okay.
Once it's set off in a direction, it's very hard to course correct. And so what we've seen is extremely heavy-handed moves to try to stop these policies, which weren't really the initial intentions ahead of time. But they should have thought of this before they made before they issued the policy, before they allowed all these moves to happen. They should have thought. It didn't take a genius, and this is not using the benefit of hindsight, but so many things that the CSL and the CFA, the Chinese Football Association, have done to correct moves. They should have been able to to predict.
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating example, like 上有政策下有对策, right? Where all of a sudden you see the government see that these enormous things are happening, and as you've written about, they change the regulations in a way that they think can get around it, but all of a sudden the clubs are creative enough to figure out ways to keep signing these players on different transfer agreements, or come up with ways. I think my favorite one, you talked about how there was a regulation where they had to play, under 23 Chinese players on the national team at least every game. And what would they do? They'd bring them on in extra time for 2 or 3 minutes, right? I mean, it's clear that people are responding to incentives, and the regulators either aren't tough enough or don't understand that you need to you make things in the spirit, not the letter of the law. I mean, it's really interesting, the dynamic between the soccer powers that be and the clubs themselves.
And it's so frustrating sometimes to watch, because for all the good intentions, I talked about the policy document, which was a 50-point document, which was very, very sensible. For all of that, for example, just this week, Shanghai SIPG won the Chinese Super League. For the first time in their history. It was the first time in 8 years that Guangzhou Evergrande have not won the title. So this was a big moment. And the Chinese media now, the state media, have been proclaiming Wu Lei, who's one of their star strikers, who scored a ton of goals. And he played very, very well. They're saying, well, this is vindication of the club's youth policy. Now, Wu Lei is 26. He's not bound by these under 23 rules. And they were specifically referring to the increased time of the Chinese young players this year versus last year.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with Wu Lei. It's like, it's just, again, so nothing will change because it's people trying to give credit to the misguided policies that were brought in and now trying to justify. There was another, the People's Daily were saying that the 3 party members were in the Shanghai team were basically leading the charge this season. I mean, it's absolute nonsense.
Can you talk a little bit about the final clinching game and the sort of missed opportunity that the league had to promote itself?
So the unofficial attendance, it takes a few days for them to confirm attendances, was about just a little bit under 19,000. As Shanghai SIPG beat Beijing Renhe 2-1. There was 2 games left in the season. They only needed 1 point to claim the title. So everyone was expecting them to clinch the title. They had a big trophy celebration on the pitch afterwards, so it wasn't a big surprise. And this was the first time in the club's pretty short history that they were able to do this. And again, the first time in almost a decade that we've had a new winner of the Chinese Super League. So this should be celebrated. It should be an absolutely packed attendance. And as one of the more recent clubs, they don't perhaps have the history of some of the other CSL clubs, but there's certainly enough people who would have
to fill a stadium. Sure.
But in all their wisdom, the officials said, you know what, we're going to restrict this to season ticket holders only. So the stadium, for what should be one of the biggest nights in the history of the Chinese Super League, was 1/3 full, almost exactly 1/3 full. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's such a waste.
Again, the context being that the Shanghai Expo is going on, lots of people gathering.
They just see that this is an inconvenience. This is bad. People, football fans can't be trusted. People get too many people in one place is a bad thing. Based on some of the other decisions we've seen over the last years, to be honest, fans can probably be thankful that the match even took place. It wasn't cancelled or postponed for a month or something stupid. But it was such a wasted opportunity, as you said. Imagine all the kids that could have been part of this moment and been fans for life.
Sure.
Fans of the sports, fans of the team, Chinese fans, instead of all the soccer fans who say, who still today laugh and say, no, I don't support a Chinese Super League team. They're all terrible. I still follow German and Italian and Spanish and English football.
Yeah.
This is a chance to really develop the fan culture, and that's what I said, it's so frustrating.
Going to a CSL game, I think, is a real encapsulation of the promise as well as the challenges that are facing Chinese domestic spectator sports today. Because on the one hand, you see the passion. I mean, there are people screaming their lungs out who are clearly, thousands and thousands at these Guoan games in Beijing, which I've been to, screaming their lungs out, have incredible amounts of passion and really love the sport and love their team. But at the same time, the spectator experience is rough, right? I mean, the food is cold.
If there's any at all.
The sodas are pre-poured out and are no longer bubbly by the second half. It's a tough environment, and I think I don't think it's, it's an interesting contrast, because on the one hand, you're spending $40 million on these players, but the investment in certain other aspects of the fan experience are really lacking.
Not just the fan experience. I'll give you another example of where money is sort of misdirected. Going back to there was a game with one of the top foreign stars in Shanghai, and he was in a fairly clumsy tackle with a Chinese player. It wasn't particularly malicious. It was just a bit awkward. And he had a very nasty, Demba Ba, his name is, and he played in the English Premier League. A really top level player for China in particular. Had a bad leg break. It was pretty nasty, and people thought, that he might never play again. But the way I looked at it looked like he sort of stubbed his toe in kind of a divot on the field, on the pitch.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't a bad malicious challenge from the opposition player. The week after, they miraculously decided that they'd relay the pitch. And it came out that it hadn't been relayed in something like 5 years.
Yeah.
And it also came out that between games, midweek games, they'd been using it as a golf driving range.
Oh, Jesus.
So no wonder there were divots all over the field.
Oh, no.
Like actual golf divots. I mean, it was just you're spending all this money buying the player and then paying their wages and their medical bills. And it's wasted.
You don't want to spend the money on 5,000 kwai to put some grass down.
But still, it's just so short-sighted.
Sure. So another one of these kind of short-sighted things, I think, comes back to the national team and the way that they're organized. So recently, you wrote about how the national team were pulled for all their leagues for like a 3-month-long seclusion training camp. Again, in comparing this to the experience of Western and South America, and basically every other national team in the world, is basically they play 90% of their games, 90% of their time, and their development is with these club teams, where they get this really great coaching and they play alongside top quality talent and competition. But this is not something that the Chinese system is really embraced. So what's going on here in the relationship between the state and the national team?
So just to give a little bit of explanation of what happened is they've been trying to promote the development of Chinese young players. Now this is 100% a good thing.
Sure.
But there are ways to do it and ways not to do it. You don't force. We talked about the quota system where people are coming in for the final few minutes of the game, or sometimes starting the game and then being subbed off within about 10 minutes.
Even more humiliating.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Like with no injury, no even pretense that it was a strategical change. There are ways to incentivize teams to do this and to develop their own players rather than just forced to tick a box. So what they did, there's been a focus on under 23 players, and then this training camp was for under 25 players, and they pulled out 55 players from across the leagues while the season was still going on. It still hasn't finished. So I think there were 6 games to go. And this has a significant impact on the league. Teams might be relegated because they're missing some starters who have been pulled at a moment's notice. They were given about 3 days warning. And of course, absolutely no choice in the matter.
Sure.
That they had to go and do this training camp. So it tells you a few things, but most importantly, that the people who are making these decisions have absolutely no idea about the sport, because it's just nonsensical. There's no... I can't even. Sometimes you can find creative ways where this can perhaps be seen as a positive.
Yeah.
But like I said, the development of young players.
These guys are running like 2 marathons every other day or something.
Yes.
I mean, it's basically it's an interesting mindset thing where presumably you can imagine the thought process of, oh wow, we've had these really embarrassing losses like 6-0 to Wales or whatever. So what we need to do
train them harder.
is we got to work these guys, or we got to show that we're working these guys.
And it's reverting back to the individual, kind of the old style state-run system that does work, that has worked in the individual sports in the Olympics.
Sure.
But it just doesn't work in soccer. If you're stamping out, basically stifling out creativity, and again, this might be a bit far-fetched, but for me, I think there's something in it. Earlier this year, all the players were basically banned from displaying any tattoos visibly. So if they had tattoos on their arms or legs, they had to cover them up.
Yeah, this is post 中国游戏哈, the first season, I guess. There was a crackdown on anything hip-hop related, which then extended to tattoos, which then leads us to the Chinese soccer team, as you wrote, I think wearing bandages over their arms.
Yes. Now, I'm not saying that having tattoos makes you a better player, but it hasn't, Lionel Messi has a whole arm and a whole leg full of tattoos, so it clearly hasn't affected him. World Player of the Year countless times. As a soccer player, you need to be able to express yourself on the pitch. You need to have that creativity. You need to have that freedom to try something a bit different. If everyone knows what you're going to do with the ball, it's going to be pretty easy to play against you. You have to have players that think a bit differently, that can be creative. And if you're stifling out every ounce of creativity, whether it's covering up tattoos, whether it's forcing them to shave their heads for a military training camp and run a marathon a day, how on earth are they expected to suddenly miraculously be these great players?
Yeah.
You can't just overtrain and make them better athletes than the other countries. It doesn't work that way. Like, sport has moved on light years from that way of thinking, but these are still the decisions being made, and so that shows you who's in charge.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because on the one hand, it is very clear that people at the top of the party system care enormously about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the celebrations and the national pride coming from China qualifying for the World Cup. What was that for the South Korea World Cup was this enormous national outpouring, and the government, she is personally a soccer fan, and I think understands the connection between national pride and national soccer. But at the same time, the attention that this brings from the government's perspective is likely doing more harm than good. Or there are clearly negative side effects to all of this pressure and all of this money and all of this attention that the powers that be within the government are bringing onto the soccer system.
Yeah, I mean, let me make it clear. Like, I want to see Chinese soccer, Chinese sports succeed. I'm not trying to tear it down, but it can be so, as I said, frustrating to watch because some of this stuff is just common sense.
Yeah.
It's really not rocket science.
Yeah, I mean,
you've got to start with young players and train them for a generation and hope that they can be. There are no shortcuts to this, and you can't suddenly we can train them twice as fast and they'll become better twice as quickly. Like, no, you can't. That will destroy a player, and you're starting from scratch again. So for all the pronouncements about, we have this goal for 2035 and for 2050, which is good on paper, suddenly when it comes to the implementation, they're looking for these shortcuts. And there is no long-term thinking again. So finally, it felt like those at the top were getting it. Other countries have done this. Japan has done this, and they've put in a long-term process, and it's worked. And they're now a pretty decent team, much better consistently than China.
Sure.
But China still can't do it. And as I become slightly less optimistic each year, because as much as there is progress being made, there's also some backward steps.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have, there are these economists who do these great regressions of like a country's GDP and its size, and then like where that would leave you on based on those factors to like in the global soccer rankings, right? China is really big and really rich. The only reason, and a lot of people love the sport, right? So the only reasons at the end of the day are structural for the lack of success. So watching this is, I think, a fascinating window into understanding China and the particular neuroses of the government, watching how they interact and meddle with the soccer system. And what's interesting is that, like, with certain things, there's such an objective check on how it's going, right? There are these games and they're playing other countries. Like, you can't cheat on this. You can't steal intellectual property and then magically leap forward, right? So having this barometer is a fascinating window into the relative progress or lack thereof.
And even then, China, what we see in China, they play some relatively good teams and they get hammered.
Yeah.
So then they play India. That was the most recent game we've seen. Now India are way down the rankings. They're not learning anything from playing India. It's a total waste of time. They should be playing these better teams and forcing themselves to get better. But of course, the leadership don't like China losing, and so an edict presumably is passed down, or a decision's made that they think will please someone somewhere. But I think, and you say it's a fascinating window. I think there are some parallels. You look at, for example, when we had the stock market boom and bust a few years back.
Sure.
As much as they were saying, well, you know what, we're going to let the stock market go. But as soon as things get a little bit too bad, they revert to type, and then suddenly it's not a free market anymore, and they have the national teams basically buying the stocks to stop the slide.
Sure.
And as much as those in the sports area do appear at times to have kind of grasped what they need to do and take this long-term initiative, when it doesn't quite work immediately, again, revert to type and sort of dig in and do it the old-fashioned way. And that just undoes all the good work so quickly.
Sure. So closing on a perhaps less depressing note, let's talk a little bit about the growth and evolution of fitness as a thing in China. Definitely walking around Beijing in the building we had lunch in today, there is a trampoline exercise class where you bounce up and down on these 3-foot diameter things. I mean, it does seem both in first-tier cities as well as third and fourth-tier cities I visited that gyms and fitness is becoming much more a part of kind of like bourgeois life here. So what's behind this trend, and if you have any numbers on it and sense of the drivers?
One number that I can recall, I remember in 2011 there were 22 marathons or marathon-like road races in China. Mm-hmm. And 6 years later, in 2017, there were more than 400.
Wow!
And that growth has continued certainly through this year and beyond. And just anecdotally, you never used to see people running in the parks in Beijing or in the evening, and now you see them all the time. All these gyms have popped up, fitness gyms, spin classes, CrossFit. I don't know how much growth we're seeing or not in perhaps more interior areas of China, but certainly in the wealthier areas, it's a massive drive. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but one is it's people are kind of proud. Running, for example, you see on WeChat, everyone runs and then they share the map that they've run. You've probably seen this countless times. It's a very shareable activity. Mm-hmm. It's not a particularly sociable thing. It can be. You can run in groups, but often when people could just go running by themselves, they're doing it by themselves. But then they're kind of telling everyone, and they're sort of proud to do it. And it's not a boastful thing. But it also puts a little bit of pressure on themselves, and it puts a little bit of pressure on their friends. And generally, I think it's more acceptable. It's more well regarded. That people want to be healthier. They want to be seen to be healthy. They want to show people that they are, being active. And this is definitely a change. And this will have a dramatic effect on the next generation, because it was all about, with 10 million students graduating every year or more, all about the Gaokao and how well you could do. Sports was just seen as a distraction, mm-hmm. right? Why would you do sports after school when you could do extra tutorials? But now people are seeing the value, and everything. You're more likely, for example, to get a scholarship to the US, which is still the prized goal for a child's education.
Sure.
If you have outside interests, there's no point just being an academic robot. It doesn't matter how good your grades are. That's not going to get you there.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a real marker of a white collar society, mm-hmm. right? 40 years ago,
it's fantastic.
In China, why would you pay to exercise? Your job is working in a factory or farming, right?
Yeah.
And the more sedentary white collar lives that people adopt, the more people have their first backaches and their eyes hurt. And
of course, you had the morning routines, gym class. 5 minutes every day in the morning.
Yeah. So it is fascinating seeing this trend really come into its own in China, and I'm sure there will be I think my favorite gym class with Chinese characteristics I've had. Well, it's interesting because you don't really see a Tai Chi class that's in one of these special gyms, but some more Japanese inspired stuff. You'd see a kendo class, that sort of stuff. MMA is also something that seems to have been taking off. More and more boxing gyms. Maybe talk a little bit about the tension between one fighting championship and UFC in China and the rise of these combat sports here on the mainland.
Well, it's not so much the tension between them. It's more just the maturity of the sports market.
Sure.
Everyone knows about the potential for the Chinese market just because of the size. But really from a sport perspective, particularly a new sport coming in, it's how quickly can you monetize? Are you able to monetize? And how quickly can you do that? So how much should you be investing, spending, and what kind of returns can you get, and how quickly can you get them? I mean, we've seen, as we said, online sports platforms effectively go bust because they've overspent, because they have looked at the big boom and just thought that it was going to be bigger than it was. They've got the trend right. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's been a bit of a correct, and they'd overstretched, and so Le Sports is the one I'm talking about. Basically lost all their TV rights.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the NBA. I mean, they basically had decades of free advertising because people would, watch their games for free streaming online, or these pirated channels that actually went out on CCTV. But it was so early that, they didn't feel like they were losing all that much. But now, if you're One Sports or UFC and you want to break into the kind of media feeds of Chinese customers, you're going to have to pay money and advertise to get yourself noticed.
And Chinese sports fans, unfortunately, don't really like to pay big money to watch sports events.
Sure.
The concert tickets are generally far more expensive and get full houses than the sports events.
Interesting.
For example, CSL games, it's pretty hard to buy tickets. Certainly as a foreigner, it's almost impossible to buy a ticket on the website, so you've got to go through the scalpers. But you can get cut price tickets very easily, even apart from the few games that are sold out. But if you're coming from a Western perspective, for example, boxing with a big pay-per-view model and the tickets to these big fights,
thousands of dollars.
I mean, the Mayweather McGregor sort of cross-discipline fight was streamed for free in China because they were just happy for anyone to watch it.
Yeah.
But it was I forget how much it was. It was
$100 something, whatever.
$100 in the States and something similar in the UK and elsewhere. So
sure.
Yes, people are starting to pay for content, but not that much. And the question is, how much will they be prepared to pay, and how quickly?
Sure. And particularly for stuff that they're not familiar with, there are no Chinese stars in these disciplines yet, right? It's generally, it's interesting because on the one hand, people say, oh, like as soon as we get the next Yao Ming and X sport, then then it's going to blow up. It's a bit of a chicken or an egg problem, right? Yeah. On the one hand, you can quote unquote manufacture a Yao Ming by having someone, incredibly tall who's skilled. But a lot of these other sports, it's not that easy, right? Particularly these ones that aren't as routine dominated like the gymnastics and diving of the world. So it really takes millions of Chinese kids being interested and playing for fun and having the right coaching to create that next superstar in MMA, in soccer, and in what have you. But if you don't have that interest and you don't have people watching the sport all the time, then those kids aren't going to be the ones to choose whatever sport you're into.
Exactly. I think there's too much focus sometimes on you finding the next Yao Ming and the next Li Na or whoever it is, because you're not going to find another Yao Ming. I mean, he was one of the tallest people that the world has ever seen,
sure,
like on the planet. But you can have another Chinese basketball player in the NBA. There is one who's on the fringes. He's a young kid on the fringes of the Rockets team, Zhou Qi, right now, in his early 20s. There's no reason why other players can't develop. So it is creating that the business model for the sport should not be to try and win the lottery with a Yao Ming. It
sure,
should be to create that interest, and that organic interest will naturally produce Chinese players.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on China Econ.